Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. This is the second lecture we're doing on Boethius in a course that deals with philosophical underpinnings of theology. Of course, our central claim is that it's very helpful, if not necessary, at least very helpful. No, it is necessary, that's my claim, to read something, to know something about the philosophical tradition before you can really read and understand a lot of the moves that are happening in the theological tradition. Okay, so we're talking about Boethius, who is a very important transmitter into the West of the classical philosophical traditions of antiquity. Boethius claims that all things tend toward the good. And this comes out of a Neoplatonic kind of world, thought world. And a thing is what it desires. So if a thing tends towards the good, it is good as it is tending towards the good. But then, of course, we can ask, do things merely participate in the good? Or are they good by nature? If they merely participate in the good, then they are good accidentally. Now, I've argued this in a different article once, but we'll go with this for now. I'm not sure about this, but this is at least how I believe Boethius sets this up. If they merely participate, then they are good accidentally. If, however, they are good by nature, then a thing would be goodness itself, which is God. Okay. So are you going to participate? Do things participate in good or God? That's very Neoplatonic, right? And is this an accidental predication or is it a substantial predication? He claims that a thing is good because it is not possible not to be good. Now, I know that's going to seem very odd here. This is a modal account he tries to give of goodness, and basically this relies on some Aristotelian work. Certainly the past is necessary. The present, which is happening, is what it is. And in a sense, a thing that is good, and it is not possible, now that it is good, not to be good. But of course, then a philosophical question for anybody that thinks about modal logic, which I try to think about sometimes, is, well, it could have been not good, you know. It would seem to be, the way we look at things with regard to modal logic, that this would be a contingent good rather than some sort of necessary good. But you have to understand the work here and how necessity and possibility is applied at this time, not merely with respect to what we call aleatic concerns, which would be a global necessity and possibility even of a logical, conceptual, or metaphysical type, versus so-called tense logic, which talks about it's not possible to change the past, but of course the past could have been other than what it was. But of course it can't now. So you get into all these questions. It's enough for you to know at this point that Boethius was thinking these things and that these things are in the tradition and that theologians would think these things as well. Now, he writes a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which is kind of an interesting book because it's, of course, a dialogue between Boethius in his prison cell, waiting to be executed. And, of course, he got on the wrong side of a political concern. He wasn't a bad guy. He's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But anyway, he sits there, and Lady Philosophy appears to him, and she gives the consolation of philosophy. Now, the interesting thing about this, he's a Christian, right? I haven't mentioned that, I should. He's a Christian philosopher and theologian, and he certainly argues Christian theses here and there. But there is no explicit Christian consolation here. It's not like this is talking about the resurrection of the flesh and Jesus and all of this. Rather, Lady Philosophy seems to want to show Boethius that true happiness is invulnerable to any circumstance, which takes us back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. Well, Aristotle less, but certainly Socrates, right? And Stoicism. True happiness is found in wisdom, virtue, and self-sufficiency. That sounds pretty Stoic. The perfect good and happiness just are God. God just is perfect good and felicity. So we have to somehow participate in God or be connected very intimately to the goodness and happiness of God, who has a wonderful property that God has. It's that God doesn't need us, right? God is impassible, not impossible. Impassible. God is not able to be affected by another thing, because if God is simple, right, then everything we say of God, we're just basically referring to this divine substantiality in a different way. There is no true affection in God, no true passion in God. So God is without passion. Things cannot affect God because God is full of God's self, right? That's what it is. Of course, Aristotle famously said that God is thought thinking itself. So, I mean, again, in the tradition, there's a very kind of different idea in this philosophical tradition of what God is than we certainly encounter in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? Torah, the Pentateuch. So perfect good and happiness just are God. God just is this. But how is individual happiness found if God is just perfect happiness? How am I saved, right, if God is this? So here in the Consolation of Philosophy, Lady Philosophy explains that God runs the universe as a final cause. God is the good all things desire. And you can run this back in the tradition, certainly to the Neoplatonic tradition, but even Aristotle talks about the unmoved mover luring the universe into being as a final cause. But how does this non-interventionist God, this God now as a final cause to which everything is flowing, all things desire, how does this non-interventionist God produce happiness? The good is happiness, and of course philosophy consoles movement towards goodness. So philosophy is supposed to somehow get us to connect. Now you might be thinking of Augustine, right? And how the early Augustine was thinking similar things. And Boethius is thinking these things 100 years after Augustine. But of course, Augustine makes a change here. Anyway, the wicked have no goodness and thus no happiness. Well, okay, if we call this in philosophy co-referential expressions, if goodness and happiness are co-referential expressions of the same thing, then if something does not have the property of goodness, it will not have the property of happiness. Now, they might feel happy. They might, hang out at the nice 6th century bars, early 6th century bars, and have a good time, but they're not happy. Of course, we always have this problem. The philosopher comes up to somebody that's just out and having a good time, saying, you're really not happy, and then you've got to convince them that they're not happy. That's always fun because they feel happy. Well, of course, the philosopher coming out of this tradition and with having Aristotle in his hip pocket knows that happiness is not a feeling, right? Happiness is this wisdom and virtue and self-sufficiency and this ability to, in some sense, be above it all, right? The transitoriness of temporality can never devour us. Right? The vicissitudes of time can never overcome the one who is full of being. So the wicked have no goodness, no happiness, and of course goodness and being convert. If goodness, then being. If being, then goodness. This is called the conversion of goodness and being. You can talk about this with your friends. They have no true being. So an absence of being is an absence of goodness, which is an absence of happiness. Okay, so then, of course, we have this discussion of choice, human freedom, so-called free choice. Boethius, of course, understands that if God's somehow in control of things, and God is somehow providential, then, of course, how is it that human beings have free choice? And, of course, we saw this in Augustine. This is so-called problem. This is called the so-called problem of future contingents, right? Arnie can do X or Arnie cannot do X at time T2 in the future. But if God exists now and already knows what Arnie will do in the future, then how can Arnie in the future actually do not X if God knows now that Arnie will do X? See? Well, Boethius gives a classic answer to this, which I'll get to. But, of course, at this point he says, we are free to the extent we understand through contemplation that these things are free for God. So we have to have a kind of a participation, if you will, in God. We have to climb the ladder to the higher standpoint. And some of you are saying, oh, this sounds like Spinoza. You're getting all excited about Hegel at this point. Well, yeah, I mean, these guys didn't just pop up, you know. Spinoza was walking down to grind some lenses one day, and he thought of these things. This is in the tradition, you know. Spinoza, the great philosopher who lived after Descartes, thought that we became free when we could understand our necessity as a mode of God. Okay, and this same kind of thing appears to be going on here to a certain extent. Okay, now back to the contingency argument. If it seems that if God knows every future event, then each event must happen. Bring about God being about. So presumably God knew 12,000 years ago that I would say this word rather than that word. So do I have it? Do I have the power now to bring about that God was wrong about this 12,000 years ago? Well, of course, much of the problem here goes away if one can grasp what Boethius means by eternity. Now, some of you out there are thinking of eternity this way. There's a time, T1, and then there's another time, T2, that comes after T1, and there's a time, T3, time, and it goes on and on and on, right? So it goes on. For every temporal event, there's one that comes after. Now, Aristotle would have called this the potential infinite, by the way, adding one thing to another thing to another thing. Boethius very famously argues that eternity, and I want you to listen to these words very clearly, is the whole simultaneous and perfect possession of unbounded life. The whole simultaneous and perfect possession of unbounded life. Now, of course, we like to watch movies about aliens. God is really alien, right? I mean, these aliens that we see in movies are nowhere near as alien as this being, God, who is a simple substance that has all of time within him and is, what, an actual infinite? Aristotle didn't think there was any. I don't want to get into a discussion on the actual infinite and the potential infinite and how that could connect to all kinds of things, including contemporary set theory. But what we want to do here is we want to think about God's eternity as simultaneous, so that all things are simultaneous to God. So there really isn't a foreknowledge, if you will, that God has. It's our way of thinking about it. There is an eternal knowledge that God has of all things. Okay? Now, if you want to read an article that deals with this, read that very famous article by Stump and Kretzmann on this issue of eternity. It was in the Journal of Philosophy maybe 30 years ago now, but it's a very famous article that tries to make sense of this claim that God can know and be related, an infinite being can know, and an eternal being can be relatable to temporality. Very interesting article. So anyway, philosophy counsels that God's eternity is the whole simultaneous and perfect possession of unbounded life. So God knows in one simple grasp, one simple apprehension. There's no discursiveness in God, right? God doesn't have to reason like Boethius and you and me. All things are eternally present to God. And so God knows everything at every time. So, of course, in the future, if Arnie does X instead of not X, then God will know that. And it will be true that God foreknew not X rather than X. But you can't put God in time. That's the point. And all of this, these arguments about providence, contingency, knowledge of future contingents, future for whom? Future for us, but not for God, right? Because there is no future in God. Right? There's no past in God. There's past for you and I, right? Time measures us. God measures time. Right? So God is not ruled by temporality. So this everlasting notion of God is perhaps not the right notion to have of God. This one right here. There's another time that God lives through and another time that God lives through. Rather, God, you might talk about it as atemporality, but that's not quite right either, because we're talking about the perfect simultaneous possession of unbounded life. And so time exists, but it's a non-temporality of time. Something more like that. Well, philosophy makes the distinction between simple and conditional necessity, and then thus there is not necessity extended to the future. And this is a famous distinction that in the tradition gets worked up as the distinction between the necessity of consequence and the necessity of the thing consequent. However, at this point, Boethius doesn't really seem to work that up quite the way the tradition did. And indeed, even at the end of this, he seems to suggest that divine prescience, foreknowledge, prescience, really does set the measure of all things, which is kind of out of keeping with his argument. So we're not sure what to make of that. But anyway, this is a categorical assertion, right? P. If P cannot be other than what P is, we stick a necessity operator out there and we say it's necessarily P. This is a hypothetical assertion. If Q, then P, right? Now, if we put a necessity operator out there, we're saying that the conditional assertion, if Q, then P, is necessary. Now, what does this mean at all? Well, if we say that Paul walking to, let's say Paul's walking to Rome, okay? If P means Paul's walking to Rome and we say that this is necessary, then it can't be the case that Paul couldn't have walked to Rome. If we say that if something happens and Paul walks to Rome, and we put a necessity operator out there, we're saying that if it's necessarily the case that something happened here, then it's necessarily the case that something happened here. So if God foreknew that Paul walked to Rome, it can be necessarily so that if God foreknew Paul walked to Rome, without it being the case that necessarily Paul walked to Rome. Now, the way one would do this, this is the so-called necessity of the thing consequent. If God foreknows that Paul walks to Rome, then necessarily it is the case that Paul walks to Rome. Now, this deals with what we call de re necessity. It's an assertion about the world. And if God foreknows at some point, then there's nothing that can change. But what Boethius seems to be getting at is this, that it's necessarily the case if God foreknows something, then that thing will happen. Now notice, with this hypothetical or conditional rendering, we're not asserting that necessarily Paul walks to Rome. We're only asserting that if God foreknows that Paul walks to Rome, Paul walks to Rome. If this is not clear, it's all right. But these are the kinds of arguments that you find now in the medieval tradition as theologians. During the Dark Ages, now you got to remember, we have this prejudice, this is all the Dark Ages, all of these things are happening in the Dark Ages, and learning has been expunged in the West. This is what I learned in 6th grade. I learned in 6th grade about the Dark Ages that all learning was expunged in the West and nothing was happening of any real value until the Renaissance. And of course, all you have to do is crack open the books from the Middle Ages and you see that these guys are not dimwits. Okay, final remarks. This is the slide you've all been waiting for on Boethius, right? So, to what degree, we might ask, is the consolation of philosophy to be taken literally? Is he just really wanting to offer this literally and not really talk about Christ and the cross and all of that stuff? Why would he do that? Or is he being ironical? Is he saying, well, this is kind of the best we'd have if we didn't have Christ and the cross? Well, if he's being ironical, why is he being ironical? Why does the Christian Boethius not mention Christ and the cross? So that's a big question. Boethius' work on logic and his categories remain influential until the 13th century. So that's a lot of centuries, right? Another 6. The consolation remains important for the next 7 centuries, even longer, see? And Boethius, of course, is the main conduit by which the Greek philosophical works are known in the West. He was the last guy that really knew Greek really well and could read the texts in the original language and understand them and comment on them. So, a very important thinker within the tradition of Greek philosophy and the philosophical development in the West that became very important for theological work. So at this point, I'm going to pause. We'll come back with a lecture now on another thinker of the Neoplatonic origins 3 centuries later, and I'll be right back with you. Thank you.